Hi class. Lab 42 is called Student Grades, and it is our first assignment where we will be making use of an array. Recall that an array is made up of contiguous memory locations that can store the same data type and can be accessed using a single name, an array name, in conjunction with an index. So for student grades, we're going to write a program that reads in 5 student grades and outputs the grades with the averages of the grades. Your program should include the following items. We need a 5-element array of integers called student grade. So the array name is going to be student grade, and it's going to be capable of storing 5 integer values. A for loop to read each grade into the array and output the score for each student. So what we're going to be doing is reading in a grade and then outputting that grade. And I'll go into more detail on that in a bit. And then inside that for loop, not only are we going to be reading in a grade and outputting a grade, but we also need to keep an accumulator that sums up all of the grades. So in other words, a running total of the grades. And then we're going to write a second for loop to display the average in the specified format. So let's look at the sample input. These values represent the 5 grades that we need to read in. And we can assume that the first grade belongs to student 1, the second grade to student 2, and so on. And as we read in those values, we're going to store them in our array memory location, and then we're going to output the data. So here we have output student space, and this one will be an offset of our loop counter. So in other words, we're going to use a counter to access our elements in our array, because remember, elements in an array start out with index 0. So when we read in this 90, we need to store it at our student grade sub 0 location. And this needs to be at student grade sub 1, student grade sub 2, student grade sub 3, and student grade sub 4. So notice our index of our array elements start out at 0 and go to 4. So that is 1 less than the size. That 4 is 1 less than the size of the array. The array has 5 elements in it. The reason being is because we start our index out at 0. 0 to 4 is actually 5 elements. All right, let's look at the actual code. And then I'll explain to you in the code how this is being calculated and output. All right, in our Lab 42, we have a constant that is the size of the array. So this is my array definition. What this does is reserve 5 memory locations that are capable of storing integers. So each memory location reserves 4 bytes of memory. So I can store a unique integer in each of those memory locations. And then the next variable I have is my accumulator. Remember I said that we need to accumulate the total of all of the scores, the grades, the student grades. So we will be doing that using an accumulator variable called sum. In line 14 we have a comment that says for loop to read in the grade of each student and add it to the accumulator. So we need to use this loop to do multiple things. Read in a grade into our array, output the student and the grade, and then add the value that we read in to our accumulator variable called sum. So as a review, our for loop starts out with the initialization section. Remember, the first element in your array is indexed by 0. So let's go ahead and make a counter I. And by the way, it's customary to use I and J as the index of your array, so that it's just short and easy to use as your array index, and it's easy to use as your counter in your for loop. The for loop is the perfect loop to use to iterate through an array. So our initialization section here, we have I equals 0. Remember, the test section should control how many times the loop repeats. So because this array has 5 elements in it, and our index for those 5 elements ranges from 0 to 4, we can put I less than size here, and this will be sufficient because I will be 0, and then if we make an update section I++, I will range from 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. When I becomes 5, we will fall out of our loop. That's perfect. All right, in the body of this loop, you are supposed to do 3 things. The first thing you need to do is read in a value into your array. So this would be a CN statement, and you need to read into your student grade array. Now what comes next is the subscript of the element that you want to read into. So this is going to read a value into, the very first time through this loop, student grade sub 0. The second time through your loop, you're reading into student grade sub 1, then student grade sub 2, and so on. So with this, you have what you need to figure out how to output. You need a cout statement. Now notice that this changes each iteration of the loop. So this being the student number changes at each iteration of the loop. So when you are outputting your student information, you still output student space like this, but then there is a variable required here, and it's really just going to be your I counter offset by 1. If you output I plus 1 here, it will appropriately output student 1 through student 5 in your output. And then you need to output a colon, and then you need to output student grade sub I. So I'm going to let you finish that out. I'm putting some ... so you know to finish it. And the last thing you need to do in the body of this loop is add your student grade to your accumulator variable called sum. So you need that statement to accumulate into your accumulator sum, student grade sub I. I'm going to let you write that. Add student grade sub I to your sum accumulator variable. All right, after you fall out of this loop, you have everything you need to create this output. You will need another for loop, and that is because we first need to output the average of, and then we need to iterate through the array to get to our values. This is student grade sub 0, this is student grade sub 1, student grade sub 2, student grade sub 3, and student grade sub 4. Okay, so that's going to require another for loop so you can output the data in the array. So what I want you to do is output the average of before the for loop. Then you can even use the same I counter as your for loop and write another for loop here. But inside this for loop, you need to think about how you're going to create a statement to output your data correctly. So if I is either a 0, 1, 2, 3, so in other words, when your counter is less than 4, you need to output student grade sub I followed by a comma space. This is student grade sub 0, this is student grade sub 1, this is student grade sub 2, this is student grade sub 3. They all have output that looks exactly the same. So if your I counter is less than 4, or you could say if your I counter is less than size minus 1, you output your student grade sub I and then the literal value, comma space. Okay, once you've got that output, then you're ready to output your next value that is stored in your array. So you'll be outputting student grade sub 1 followed by a comma space, then student grade sub 2 followed by a comma space, then student grade sub 3 followed by a comma space. So this is in the body of your for loop. This correlates to use a conditional expression inside the loop to determine which grade you're outputting so the sentence will be formatted correctly. So that's what I'm explaining to you right now inside this loop. So if your I counter is less than 5, you need to output student grade sub I with a comma space after it. Else, you need to output and space and, then student grade sub I, and then space is space, and then the average. Okay, so the average calculation can be inside your cout statement. You should have in sum your accumulator variable, the sum of all of the values, and so you need to divide that by size to get the correct average. Now make sure that you set up your manipulators so that you can get a number that has 2 significant digits after the decimal point. Okay, let me know if you need any help.